Hello there, folks. Hopefully you watched part 1 of this series on drawing big and little cats. In this 25-minute lesson, we will focus on a wide variety of techniques on subjects like value, texture, markings, and anatomy, and even expression. I will be starting out with colored pencil, but then move on to markers, ink, and ballpoint pens. Though most of these examples take longer and are layered and more complex, the focus is still taking these skills out and using them as you field sketch with real animals at the zoo. So I thought I'd start out the video with a simple house cat, just because the structure is so simple, and I sort of figured that a lot of people are going to be drawing their cats at home, so what a good way to start out. And so this is basically the way I put it together. I think of a large ball with a small box at the end, and you can see the axis lines, making sure that the features are in the right place, the ears are the right size, and then I get all the proportions right at first before I launch off into a lot of shading and fur and markings. So once I nail down those basic forms, I start to put the features in. And I don't go in blindly, but I have an idea and the knowledge of how those features fit inside that basic structure that I've set up. So as I go in and sketch and place features, I have a basic set of rules about how to block out the features and what makes them unique to my animal subject. These diagrams from my animal drawing book will give you a simple path to follow. Once I have that basic structure down, then I start to lay in the features and the anatomy. As you can see, I'm sort of adding the cheekbones a little bit more, hitting the chin. There's the nasal bone that I'm putting in there, making sure I sort of get all those features kind of set up inside the head so it doesn't just look like a flat representation. Later on in the drawing process, I'll be adding the hair, fur, and value, and I'm setting up all the interlocking forms of the skull, the muzzle, and the eyes so the textures and shadows accent the whole head concept and make it look much more appealing. So as I keep drawing here, you'll see I use a combination of large flowing forms and sharp staccato little angles where it comes down to the bone in certain areas. If I wasn't working off a photograph, I'd be putting all this information in at the same time, the anatomical information, textural information, even the lighting information by laying in the little darker lines on the underside of the form, just because I'm not quite certain how long my subject's going to be there for me to draw. Speaking of the devil, here's my little cat Buddha that I drew the other day. A little pen sketch in the front room. So as we move along in the lesson, the idea is to lock together the learning curve here and moving on to drawing mountain lions. I added this diagram from my animal drawing book so you can look at and read the comparisons before we jump into the next step. As I sketch out this profile view of a mountain lion, I'm accenting those large oval cheeks, muzzle, and socket above the eyes. I'll be using that information later to chart out the direction of the fur and the shadow pattern on the face. Eventually when I get to it, you'll see that those marks that I put down for the fur and for the shading will move right along those forms, sort of like ripples moving down a creek bed. You'll get a series of lines and values sort of interlocking but still moving in a very fluid way over those forms to help sculpt out the surface forms more. Once again, I bring up the diagrams of the simple, unique traits of the cougars. As I'm drawing at the zoo, I'm using these examples as a template or a guide. That's what's in the back of my head. I use this as a method to make sure my sketch is heading in the right direction in case something feels wrong or something feels out of balance. Okay, now I'm just going to sketch and fill in some of the forms a little bit. Perhaps you notice that I hit the features first. If I'm out in the field or at the zoo drawing, one of the things I do is I kind of make sure that I acknowledge that real quickly for the fact that if the animal moves or I have to fill in the information later, The hair and the texturing can be done at my convenience a little bit later during breaks, or even later in the comfort of my studio. I really start to lay in the texture and fur pattern next, but remember, all that detail or visual noise should be edited down to enhance the whole design of your creature, whether it's just the head or the entire body in motion. The color of the fur and the value of the markings are secondary to the light that falls on the head. Though I'm using a photo for reference, I draw to the idea that I'm outside drawing in the field. So I edit and invent the light logic I desire, and the light source is coming in from the above right. So that's why I leave the surface angled to facing the light source more empty. No matter how dark the fur is, I want the viewer to see how the texture of the fur flows over the animal's sculptural form. So in this next part of the lesson, we're going to be moving into a mixed media. And I'll be using water pens and brush pens, which have an ink-filled cartridge in them with a painting tip, and then polychrome pencils and watercolor pencils. Also some water-based Faber-Castell markers, and at the end, ballpoint pens, which I use a lot, and fountain pens, which make for a really wide variety of line quality. In this next lesson, I'll be using a cougar as my model. The basic design is focused on the simple shapes to check my proportions and believability. I don't have much interest in copying the animal, whether it's in a photo or live, but I make sure it reads and has the correct forms and characteristics of my subject. That's why I sort of lock in those generic measurements, sort of like from the width of one cheek to the other cheek, the edge, and then from the top of the head down to the chin, and then the distance across the eyes, across the nose, the distance from the nose down to the chin, all these different little aspects to make sure that even as it's moving around, I have those sort of landmarks in my head so I can constantly sort of fact check what I'm putting together to make sure it doesn't get out of proportion. That's why even if you have a rudimentary sort of idea of what the anatomy is, it's really helpful because you can see that I'm laying in the cheekbones, and the muzzle goes up and sort of curves up and around the eyes, and you can see the eye sockets reaching up into the top of the head, and even the markings and the textures follow all of this information around those bony forms that are there. So even if you don't have an expert knowledge of it, it's good to know that, just so you'll be able to make your drawing a little bit more believable and a little bit more solid. So I'm using a large water-filled pen with a light ink solution to wash in what will become the darker shadowed areas. Notice that once again I follow more of the shadow pattern on the animal rather than the values in the photograph. So frequently what is dark in the photograph ends up being lighter in the drawing, yet the lighter areas underneath the chin and back in the jaw end up being darker just because that's more of the idea of the light logic on top of the creature. So once I've established the rhythm of the lights and the darks, I move more into identifying and bringing up the features more. Now I use a slightly darker mixture of value to sort of knock in the features a little bit more, and using a combination of the shadow pattern and the darkness of the textures. So you'll see me going around the edge of the muzzle or down into the mouth. And again, I'm trying to establish more of a rhythm and just sort of get an idea of the bigger picture before I go in and commit to the lines and the outlines, contour lines that are going to be involved with finishing the drawing up. Now at this point you can kind of see the pyramid of values that I'm building up, and now I'm coming in with these like darker accents using the brush pen, but not letting the darkness overwhelm the entire drawing, right? I'm not drawing huge black areas around the eyes, because one thing is I've seen them in person, and even though the darkness is there, it's not that overwhelmed. Photographs have a tendency to kind of lie to you a little bit. And you lose the subtleties of light that you see in person with the light bouncing off the cheeks and up underneath the eye sockets, or the softer fur around the muzzle. Now at this point I'm going to start to bring in the colored pencil in as the surface texture over the top of the rhythm of the lights and the darks that I've built up with the water pens. Remember, this is a step-by-step lesson plan here, and when I'm in the field I'm constantly sort of skirring back and forth between different methodologies and different materials depending on the subject and depending on what kind of vibe or aesthetic that I want in the drawing. The greater points in this approach is the fact that you're hopefully learning how to kind of blend these different techniques together, so you'll be a lot more sort of fluid as you're drawing the animal out in its natural environment. To be able to mix and match approaches and different methodologies so you can come up with your own sort of way of doing things using these techniques as a guide. So if I'm using watercolor pencils, I'll lay down these sort of soft tracks that frequently I'll go over the top with water afterwards, and it'll soften them up and turn them almost into watercolor. On the other hand, I'll use a polychrome pencils, which no matter how much water you put over the top of them, they won't dilute and they won't spray out. So you have a much more defined sort of sense of line and a different kind of texture over the top of it. I'll use that a lot more for the features and a lot more for the fluidity of drawing the fur on top of the creature. You can see I'm frequently taking my pencil and laying it on its side, so again you get that sort of soft fluid flow, which gives a different sort of personality and characteristics of whatever creature you're drawing. So if I don't have any big cats sitting around the house and need practice, I'll go to YouTube and then stop and start the videos and watch the movement along with the facial features and such. But when I do look at photographs to study the textures of the animal, I make sure that my strokes and my marks that I end up drawing or sketching along with always sort of reinforces the form of the figure rather than just a texture pattern. So that's why in these videos I'm constantly sort of reinforcing the idea of simplicity. So whether you're drawing your cat at home or you're out on safari drawing big cats out in the wild, you always be able to sort of boil it down to a simplicity, recognizability, surface form, and texture to make your drawing more solid, sculptural, or in a gestural quick sketch way, solid and hold the page. So in the last pass on this, I'm taking the water pen and sort of softening up some of the edges and reinforcing the shadow pattern. So before we get started on the next step of the lesson, I just want to reintroduce you to the materials we'll be using, because I'll be combining value, texture, shadow patterns, and expression and anatomy together for one drawing. So the basic layout is similar to what we've shown before. In fact, it's almost for just about everything I draw in paint. I use a very similar sort of shape design language to put the drawing together. What I mean by shape design is whether the shapes are the rectangular, rounded, or a combination of those elements. I consider the muzzle and the upper portion of the head to be square and more angular, the lower jaw to be more triangular, and the cheeks to be more like ovals or ball shapes. In using this technique, it takes all the confusing details out and allows you to draw the primary steps and get the proportions correct before moving on to the annoying details. It also makes for an easier way to apply in gesture drawing in real life at the zoo or at home. So at this point I added these couple of diagrams so you can see the characteristics of the animal. You can use these diagrams as a template to help you along as you build up the characteristics and the features of the animal that you're drawing. So once again, I'm going to go in and hammer the features a little bit more, so then when I put the value on top of it, you'll be able to see these landmarks in relationship to how the drawing progresses. So at this point, I'm going to bring the tiger skull in so you can be able to see the landmarks on that in relationship to the values that I'm going to put down. And even the effect it has on the relationship to where the teeth are and how the teeth are inserted into the jaw, and make that a realistic step in this process. The reason I add the skull there rather than just having the photograph is, again, you can see the way the anatomy influences how the whole thing is created, and then when I put the landmarks in later, how it'll float right on top of that form. My continued objective here is to reinforce the idea that I'm trying to paint and draw this very sculpturally, not just as a flat sort of representation of the photograph. So at this point, I have the design pretty much nailed down, and I'm going over the top of it with a watercolor pencil. So when I bring the water and the brush pen over a little bit later, it'll sort of fuse the lines out and make the edges of the mane a lot more softer and pliable. It will give it a much more of a painterly appearance. So as I lay that water and ink into it, you'll notice it looks pretty dark. Well, that's just relative. I usually go to the darker part of the creature first, just to make sure I get my values down before I move on to more subtle lit areas on top of the head or on the side of the muzzle or such. I also have a tendency to sort of bounce around the painting a little bit. That way I can see the relativity of all the different values as they sort of work together. And like I said before, I sort of built up a shadow pattern of rhythmic lines and values. So usually I start out the darker areas with a lighter sort of wash of color or water in first, but I wanted to go with more of a high contrast because of the dramatic lighting. So before I really dive into the features, here's a chart of the characteristics of the tiger that I'll be looking for before I start to go in and really amp up the line and value working together. So now I'm adding a mid-tone into it to kind of fill that middle area in between the highlights on the top of the head and the darkness underneath the mane and into the mouth. And again, if you notice the skull diagram right to the next, you can see how my lights and darks are referencing that anatomical detail underneath. So perhaps you'll notice that I'm already putting the stripes on it and putting in some of the facial features mid-tones, but I'm not hammering them in. I know the stripes will be black, but I want to make sure they kind of feather out first before I go in and hammer in those black stripes. Even when I hammer in the black stripes, they're not all going to be black because that would overtake the entire design, and I don't want that to happen. So up to this point, I've kept it relatively painterly, but now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and really pull up the emotion and accent what the tiger is doing and how his face is reacting to those stresses that are being put on top of it. Perhaps you'll notice I'm doing a lot of editing still in the face, making sure that when I put the lines down and reinforce the expression, that it is very focused and it doesn't go all over the place. I've made it an important point to leave out the whiskers so it doesn't obscure the anger in the mouth and allows me to accent the emotion over the needless detail. An important point I try to get across here is as I'm putting the stripes in, you may notice that rather than making them these solid black shapes, I try to sculpt them more towards the idea of the fur and the form of the animal rather than trying to just obliterate and make them sharp cutouts. I use the ink drawing underneath as sort of an underpainting that I put the textures over the top of or accent certain parts of the anatomy or the expression. You might have noticed that I'm really leaving the orange coloration of the cat alone and instead focusing much more on the patterning of the stripes and the idea of when I do even draw the stripes on the top of the head, there's a lot of space in between those marks. So again, it's more the light logic that I'm concerned about. I've applied that orange color pattern in a lot of my other drawings, but it was because of a design choice that is built into my sketches because it gives a more complete sculptural appearance. This drawing focuses more on the tiger's expression, therefore I edited it out. Once again, here's the materials I'll be using for this lesson, the last step in this process. So in this last drawing, I'm going to be using this photograph of this alpha male that I took in Kenya. I'm doing a light, simple pencil layout over the top of this because I know I'm going to be putting a lot of value and texture over the top of this preliminary drawing. So contrary to the last example that I did with the tiger, in this one I'm going to go in with a lighter value sketch over the top of it to unify that large mane of his and to make sure that it complements the profile of his face. I'm using a water pen with my own mixture of ink in it to make sure I sort of block in the larger forms first before getting started on the smaller nuances and details. Once again, I'm setting this up as a shadow pattern. Again, as I do this, my eye wanders over the top of my subject, and I start to think about where all the little details or where the features or even where the different values are going to be set up later in it. That's why you see sometimes I leave large sections of white paper, even though there is value there, because I'll fill that in later as I become more settled in on exactly what my intention is as I paint along. I added a couple of diagrams to the left, so once again you can see the characteristics of the animal that I'm going to try to get down and what I'm going to kind of put in that memory bank as my eye does sort of flow over the top of my design, whether it's a long drawing off a photograph or whether it's a quick sketch done out at the zoo. Once I get that big shadow pattern down, now I'm coming in with a slightly warmer marker and sort of knocking in a little bit more of the texture of the mane. Perhaps you also notice that I'm designing from the photograph and not copying the photograph. There are some dark areas underneath there that I'm going to keep a little bit more light on because the light is coming from the left-hand side onto the right-hand side of the photograph and the subject. So with the shadow pattern set up, but still not filled in, I still want to give myself enough jimmy room in there to be able to move around. I use this 3/4 semi-black brush pen here to kind of work up the texture a little bit more. As you can see, I just went over that white area, coming in with a few strokes for the mane. So I am trying to get the hair in here and make that part of the design. About 75% of it is the mane. So I have to make sure that that really works, but not distract from the features of the face that are going to go in, and that magnificent profile of this alpha male. I feel confident enough to now start to go in and sort of make more accents on the features. And I'm going to bring up these diagrams again so you can see these main characteristics of this male lion that you will want to be putting on the top of your drawing, or at least adding into the rest of your drawing. These diagrams are rather generic, but once again, if you're out there drawing the real thing, it's going to really help to have this inside of your brain pan to be able to pull out and figure out what's going right or wrong with the drawing. And I'm bringing out this pointer to show those little accents of where I'm going to be putting more of the darker lines or more of the texture. Again, just to sort of move the eye forward more towards the light and bring up more of the idea of the individual personality of the lion. An important point you might notice is that as I'm coming over the top of this colored pencil, is I'm not just sort of randomly putting the strokes down, but even within that large mane of hair, is I'm trying to sculpt the lines with different kind of line qualities, short and long strokes, dark and light ones. Again, more to sort of show the idea of it's sort of maintained and designed, and to help the more sculptural ability of the entire drawing, which is one of the big concepts that I'm trying to get across here. As I come in and define the mane more, I keep reiterating this, but the idea that it's really designed, and I don't want the hair to just look like it's a bunch of spaghetti plopped on a plate. I really want to make it look designed and enhance the sort of stature of the creature. And you can see what I'm popping into the features. I'm not copying the photograph. I'm leaving enough open space so the light gets in, and the texture of the fur doesn't also interfere with the personality of the creature. Now to add another texture to it, I bring in a ballpoint pen, a uniball pen, just to kind of build up the strokes. It gives it a little bit more of a surgical kind of line to it. It sort of builds up a little bit more of a waxy base to it, so it gives it a kind of different texture to the textures you've already built up. In general, using a pen along with a colored pencil gives it a lot more dynamicism to your sketch. But on its own, it also makes a really good mark making tool, though a little bit more unforgiving than a pencil was. I also know that I'd laid the face in pretty generically with some just angular lines, and this ballpoint pen gives it this sort of last, more organic edge to things. Makes it a little bit more on the realistic side. It definitely gives it a last contour or finality to the sketch. My drawing's coming down to these sort of last final bits and pieces of pulling it all together with line and value. And so I pulled out this brush pen that's got a real black ink to it. And I'm trying to give it a little bit more weight, a little bit more texture to certain portions of the head. The black line will certainly bring more of a focus to certain things like the eyes or the corner of the mouth or the corner of the nose or even in the ear. But it's best to keep that black line or the black marks a little bit more on the minimal side. That way it doesn't overwhelm your entire drawing and design. So literally almost the last step is that if it does start to get a little too busy, I'll come over the top of it with this water brush here filled with a little bit of a light ink and then repaint over the top of it and bring all the details into the larger mass of all the other textures that I've put together. So literally the last step I make before I finish here is came over the top of it with a China marker to bring out some more of those light areas in the mane and over the top of the ear, just to make sure there's more of a highlight here and there and brings a little bit more variety into the entire design. So as we come to the end of the video, I wanted to add a couple of more drawings of mine that I've done in the field so you can see the technique actually being used away from drawing from a photograph. And certainly you do have to practice with doing this. I've said it before and I'll say it again, is that even if you're using photographs or using YouTube or using something like that, these are done at a wildlife waste station that I used to go to. And you see I left notes and I drew different versions of it and different expression, probably went home and accented stuff. So just keep up your practice. And if you need any help with this, I've got 2 animal drawing books that I wrote and published, and they're available on Amazon.com. And I hope you liked the video, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't before. Tell other people about it, and please like and comment, especially the comment stuff. I like to hear what everybody thinks, and by all means, please take this outside and go practice your craft, all right? Thanks a lot. Adios and goodbye.